music theorist might expect or a linguistic theorist might expect. A lot of psychologists like exemplar theory, although not all psychologists like exemplar theory. It turns out there are competing theories. One that's very popular is called theory theory, which essentially is that when you learn about a category, you develop a theory for what members of it ought to be, which is sort of like feature theory. In fact, feature theory is a kind of specialized version of theory theory. And there are psychologists, a lot of psychologists who take that particular theory seriously also. So that was all evidence that we store lots and lots of stuff, and that we don't categorize very much. On the other hand, is evidence for the fact that our storage is a little more abstract and a little bit more like linguists like to think that language works, or at least many linguists like to think, is when people talk, they do stuff that they didn't learn, that they weren't exposed to, that they can't have had stored in their heads. So, for example, Mandarin speakers speaking English, when trying to say a word like dog, say dog. Okay, well, where are they getting that substitution of G, of K for G from? Mandarin doesn't allow any consonants at the end of syllables except M and N. So it's not as if they know that K is better than G. They've never made any K or a G at the end of anything. So why did they substitute? But they do. Take a totally different topic, but related. When people speak, they make speech errors. A particular kind of well-studied speech error is called a spoonerism, where segments at the beginning of two successive stressed syllables, let's see if I can make the rest of this piece of the lecture without making one. Usually it's impossible. Switch positions. So instead of saying scotch tape, you say stotch cake. Okay, that's an example of a spoonerism. I assume most of you are familiar with this kind of error. As I said, they've been studied extensively. So that's a different kind. That's not a spoonerism. That's a different kind. I knew I was going to make one. Actually, since the 19th century, when a Reverend Spooner was reputed to have made them, he was famous for saying, he was a history professor, and he was famous for saying, "You have hissed all my mystery lectures. In fact, you have tasted the entire worm." In any case, it turns out if you study these things, when sounds interchange positions, they are also interchanging contexts. So, for example, when you try to say scotch tape, the k is unaspirated. That is, it's scotch and not scotch. And the t is aspirated, tape, and not tape. And the k is relatively back in the mouth, scotch. But if you make the interchange and say stotch cape, then the t becomes unaspirated. That is, nobody would ever make a speech error of saying stotch cape. Sorry, stotch cape. That's totally impossible. So the T is the K becomes unaspirated and also is fronted. Sorry, it's not fronted anymore because it's in front of an A. And the T, the K that's now in. Sorry, I should have written this down in more detail. Anyway, the K and the T adjust to their local environments. Clearly, this is processing ongoing and happening very fast, and obviously totally beyond our conscious control. Only phoneticians could say stotch cape. Okay. Speakers clearly do other stuff that indicates that they have a representation slightly more abstract than the purely surface forms that at least some people would say. So, for example, when people sing, and they slide stuff around to fit the music, they do all kinds of fine-level phonetic detail changes that nobody notices and that don't count for example, the rhyme and the rhythm of the song. So there's a song from Chicago that's sung by, sorry, I have a block on his name, Richard Gere. In the movie, the song is called Razzle Dazzle, and he has two lines where he says, "Give 'em an act with lots of flash in it, and the reaction will be passionate." Now, first of all, nobody ever taught him that he could replace, that he could put a glottal stop in the first line and have a geminate two shs in the second line. First of all, obviously he never learned that. Second of all, unless weird phoneticians like me listen carefully, nobody ever hears it. It counts as a rhyme, despite the fact that he's made modifications so that it clearly doesn't rhyme in some low-level phonetic detail, which means we don't hear the low-level phonetic detail, or in some real culturally important sense, it doesn't count. So that's evidence, again, for a slightly more abstract, or at least different representation from what actually came out of his mouth or what actually hit your ears. So what came out of his mouth, he made some adjustments to make stuff fit, and when you heard it, I would argue you're undoing those adjustments because you also speak English and you know which adjustments you can undo. And you do it online in real time without being aware of it. Other stuff that happens. When children speak, they do stuff that they did not ever hear. So Walter mentioned this research project that Eugenia and Gina Drusky and I have been working on. Our subject regularly substituted L's for R's in his Spanish. Now, as far as I know, none of the models to which he was exposed did that. Am I correct?
You are correct.
Nonetheless, he did it. Where did he get it from? He didn't learn it from his environment. It's not stored in there, but he did it. He also, for a very brief period, regularly replaced all mid-vowels with high vowels. So A and O were replaced by E and U. It was as if he was reading Roman Jakobson before he could read. Every now and then you'll hear a kid who grew up in Michigan and speaks American English, whose father is normally named Daddy. You'll hear this child saying Daddy with a D, not a flap. Where did he learn that? Clearly, he didn't learn that. That somehow, one could argue, I would argue, that he abstracted from Daddy the R sound, which is in some senses hard to make, and said, everybody around me must have been aiming at a D. D's are easier, I'm going to say a D. One could argue that that's what's going on. There's also evidence that substitutions like this are not physical limitations. That is, when children make these kinds of replacements, it's not because they can't do it at all. So there's this famous case from a study that was done in the 70s by Neil Smith, where a child systematically replaced D with G when it was followed by a syllabic L, so the child couldn't say puddle and said puggle. But at the same time, systematically replaced Z's, or Z's if you prefer, with D's in the same environment. Because although D's were hard to say in front of L's, Z's were even harder. So the child said puddle when aiming at puzzle, but puggle when aiming at bubble. So what else do we know? We hear foreign accents all the time. We hear accents, not foreign, native accents of other dialects than our own all the time. And we can apparently we apparently are able to perceive the distinctions among accents by about 19 months. Carol Fowler did some research fairly recently showing that kids can actually hear the difference between Texas and New York by the age of 19 months, in the sense that they react differently to them. But that doesn't necessarily mean we can make other accents. My father speaks somewhat modified Yorkshire English. I can't talk like my father. I can't do him. I recognize his accent. I can't do that accent. I can do Cockney. I can do some kinds of Southern, but I can't do all the accents that I can recognize. So you could argue that there's some kind of linguistic production competence, ability, that allows us to do some accents but not others, and of course allows us to do our native accent. One other piece of evidence that I think is interesting, although I'm not quite sure what to do with this, is just the fact that when we learn phonetics, we learn primarily articulatory classifications, like the sound is alveolar because it's made with the tip of the tongue touching the alveolar ridge, or we learn that a sound is rounded